You're listening to On the Job with PORAC, hosted by PORAC President Brian Marvel and Vice President Ben Therriault. On the Job with PORAC is your go-to podcast for insights into the challenges and opportunities facing law enforcement professionals here in California and across the nation. Our goal is to provide an inside look at these issues from the perspective of officers who risk their lives to protect and serve their communities.
Welcome to On the Job with PORAC, your inside look at the pressing issues facing law enforcement in California and nationally. I'm Brian Marvel, joined by my co-host, Ben Therriault. On this episode, we're going to discuss H.R. 82, the Social Security Protect Act, with our esteemed colleague and advocate with Steptoe, Darryl Nirenberg. Welcome to the show, Darryl.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, obviously, we had the great opportunity to attend the signing ceremony at the White House for what I consider a very historic event, something we at PORAC and a variety of other folks have been advocating for many, many, many years, and that's to eliminate the WEP and GPO penalties that people that received pensions unfortunately had to deal with. So I guess the first thing is why don't we talk a little bit about, just where we got that day of the signing. I mean, obviously you've been with us for a very long time and advocating for this, but, tell us about, I think the stars were just in alignment this year in order for us to get that over the line.
So, well, thank you very much, Brian. And at the outset, let me say how it has been an honor and a privilege to have represented PORAC here in Washington, D.C. for now more than a dozen years. This legislation fits into the way PORAC engages in Washington. PORAC is about making good policy, not about seeking to grab headlines. And H.R. 82 is a perfect example of that. As Brian, you mentioned, we all had the honor of being invited to the signing ceremony. A couple of things about that is a really unusual honor in this town. I do not recall ever having a client who had been invited to a bill signing. And the other part was looking at the crowd, and it was not a large crowd that was invited. California had an outside presence between the PORAC delegation and the members of Congress from California and the then Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra. So this issue had been around for 40 years. And Brian, you'd mentioned how the stars were aligned, and they were, but my father-in-law used to have a saying that funny how the people who work the hardest and are most persistent tend to have the best luck. And the stars were aligned, but they would not have been aligned but for years of consistent and persistent effort on the part of PORAC, other law enforcement, firefighters, and teachers' organizations. A big part of this was that there was a broad coalition supporting the bill, a coalition that has been growing over the years, and it included largely, as I'd mentioned, teachers, firefighters, and law enforcement. And also, there was a refusal to allow hurdles to stop the effort or slow it down. It's a perfect example, Brian, of the adage that fastest way you can get something done with law enforcement is tell them they can't do something. And this was a perfect example of not allowing hurdles to get in the way. There was also changing circumstances. Keep in mind that GPO and WEP impacted individuals who had a pension from the public sector, who then also worked in the private sector and paid into Social Security. That is becoming an increasing phenomenon. First, because the lack of retirement benefits that are tied to public service employee contracts that effectively requires individuals who retire on the early side, such as law enforcement, because of the physical demands of the job, to take a private sector job in retirement to maintain their health care benefits. So it's a double punishment in that case. Second, public servants largely are underpaid. And so many, whether you're teachers, law enforcement, or firefighters, are compelled to take second jobs to help support their families and save for the future. And they would be affected. I think the third thing is it became apparent to Congress as the number of individuals affected by this was increasing, that the current law was really harsh. First, in eliminating death benefits to a spouse. And second, the fact that when the Social Security Administration sends out statements to people who are headed into retirement, giving them their estimated benefits upon retirement at a certain age, those numbers were false. And there was no notice to tell the recipient the numbers were false. So you had countless cases of individuals who went into retirement expecting to get certain benefits and didn't get it and were forced to make life changes as a result. And I'd say the last item is that PORAC was among the leading organizations to reach out to its members and ask, how does this affect you personally? Those members who responded, and there were many of them, those were the anecdotes that were provided to Congress to show how the current law was harming people who had given their careers to their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Darryl, you really touched on the coalition, and it really was a huge effort and undertaking by a variety of groups. I don't think there's one single group out there that could take credit for any piece of this. I think it was a very broad support. I really want to also thank the West Coast Law Enforcement Association that we sort of hobbled together over the last couple of years with Alaska, Washington, Oregon, us obviously, and Hawaii. I really think we gained a lot of traction with a lot of discussions and making this a high priority when we went back to Washington, D.C. And then obviously, the other law enforcement groups, especially NAPO, and those folks were really, I think, critical in getting this over the finish line. And, being at the signing ceremony with all those people and just seeing the wide swath of representation from a vast variety of groups was just impressive. It just, like you said early on, it just goes to show you when we all come together and we fight for a common cause. And if, I always reminisce about Reagan's quote, you can get a lot done if nobody takes credit for it. So I think this was one of those situations where we had that kind of success.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Obviously, now that it is passed and, we were able to get it through the House and the White House, Social Security, they didn't allocate specific funds to let Social Security Administration focus on this. So we're getting a lot of questions. I just want to clear some of that up. I highly recommend, if you haven't been onto the Social Security Administration's website, you go on there, has all your information. You need to get the credits in order for this to qualify. But let's talk a little bit about, what happened in the House procedurally. Congressman Graves retiring. There was a point in time where it was like we were going to say, this is dead, this is done. Let's talk a little bit about the discharge petition, because that is something you don't see very often in Congress in the history of our nation.
Sure. And that's exactly right, Brian. In many ways, this was an unprecedented legislative campaign. So if you want to take a look at why after 40 years we were successful, not just the items we had talked about previously about changing circumstances, a lot had to do with political dynamics outside of Congress and the procedure in Congress. Now, first, what we're seeing is a realignment of the political parties, where Trumpism is focused on grabbing working Americans and bringing them into the Republican Party. So to some extent, we hit a perfect storm in our favor. As the legislation had traditionally received its largest support from the Democratic Party, With Trump and the realignment of the Republican Party, and the fact we had law enforcement and firefighters actively participating in promoting this legislation, groups that traditionally bring with them Republican constituencies, created a bipartisan coalition. And at the end of the day, President Trump openly endorsed the legislation, and Vice President Vance, who was then still in the Senate, was lobbying his colleagues on the Republican side to support the bill. In terms of the timing and the idea of a discharge petition, one of the challenges we'd had in the past was we were getting sufficient number of members co-sponsoring the bill, but the House Ways and Means Committee had refused to take up the bill and report it to the full House. There is a legislative maneuver that can be used in its place, which is rarely used, which is if you get a certain number of members of Congress signing a discharge petition, then that legislation is eligible to be brought up on the House floor for consideration, regardless of whether the Committee of Jurisdiction approved it. It's rarely used, it's high-handed, and it's often difficult to get it done because it effectively requires bipartisan support, and whichever party is in charge, it is sometimes seen as a challenge to leadership to skip the committee and bring it up on the House floor. In this case, we had been hoping that we could go through the committee. Main reason was because we had as our lead co-sponsor or shared sponsors in the House, Garrett Graves, Republican from Louisiana, and Abigail Spanberger, a Democrat from Virginia. Those were our leads. Garrett Graves was one of the closest allies for Speaker Kevin McCarthy. So the conventional wisdom on the Hill was, because of his ties to McCarthy, we could bring that legislation through committee in the normal course of events. When Kevin McCarthy lost the speakership, there were people in the coalition who were thinking, that's it, the game is done. Our main path to getting this legislation passed is now closed to us. But PORAC and other organizations said, no, we've come this far, we've worked this hard. Now's the time to put the pedal to the metal, because if we work it hard, give it 100%, you never know where it's going to take us. At the end of the day, we did just that. The coalition expanded its efforts, and the Ways and Means Committee did not move to report out the bill. So a petition was circulated, a sufficient number of members signed on to that petition, the vast majority of our delegation. The bill came up on the floor and the bill passed. One of the things, Brian, you had mentioned the West Coast Coalition. One of the things was, in terms of timing, was when all of this happened, when we thought all was lost, was when, Brian, you said, let's do whatever we can to get as many co-sponsors as possible from California. Let's loop in the West Coast Coalition and ask them to do the same. And so we worked during our fly-ins and subsequently to line up and encourage people to co-sponsor. At the end of the day, Brian, I think we had all but 3 of our delegation co-sponsor. What was most important, though, in the rear view mirror and retrospect, is that our delegation included some of the first Republicans to co-sponsor the bill and then sign on to the petition. We were so effective at getting, or so aggressive and so effective at enlisting co-sponsors. At a certain point, we went to the bill sponsors, the congressional sponsors, and said, tell us what other members are out there from other states we can reach out to. So in many ways, the fact that we had Republicans signing on early from California gave other Republicans across the nation some comfort that they could sign on to this bill and it would not be seen as partisan. One other item on timing is that once the bill passed the House, it went to the Senate. And the Senate is full of uncertainties. It's difficult to get time to bring up legislation, and it's very easy for an individual senator or a group of senators to throw sand in the gears. And the concern was once the bill was passed by the House at the end of the summer, that it would just sit in the Senate and die. We actually caught a great break on timing because the bill was held over to the lame duck, which is a session after the presidential election and before the new Congress starts on January 3rd. And the majority leader at that time was Chuck Schumer from New York. And he is a big supporter of this legislation. And it appeared to those advocates of this legislation that since the Senate schedule is controlled by Senator Schumer, he was not going to let the Senate go out without bringing up the Social Security Fairness Act. And the combination of him being the leader, him bringing it up for additional Democratic support, and President Trump and Vice President Vance supporting and lobbying for this bill paved the way for it to be passed.
Do you see the discharge petition as a parliamentary maneuver being used for other things that we're advocating in the future, or just a one-off?
So, Ben, that's a really good question. It's largely a one-off. It's very rarely used and successful. Part of the reason it was used and successful was because our Republican champion, Garrett Graves, was leaving the House. He retired because of his district having been eliminated in a court-ordered state redistricting.
So there's less concern about fallout, that kind of thing.
Yes. And he had a lot of Republicans behind him supporting him, which was another thing. So it's very unusual. First time I've ever seen it successfully used for any of our clients.
And I have to attribute a lot of that to the West Coast Coalition, and the fact that when all of the dust settled, we pretty much had everybody from all of those states were supportive of it, except the one in California, right here out of the Sacramento area,
Right.
ultimately voted for it in the affirmative. And I know there was a little tensions there at the end with Senator Schumer, whether he was going to let it come to the floor. And ultimately he did. But I just, man, it was just great to be a part of this historic moment in time, to pass some legislation that PORAC I know has been working on for decades, and to have the success that we've had. I'm thinking, we should probably do a follow-up to this down the road, just to see where the Social Security Administration is. I know I just recently saw it's going to take them about a year. It is retroactive for 1 full year, so people that do qualify for it will get 2024, and then obviously prospectively they'll get caught up, and moving forward they'll have those necessary adjustments. But I also want to thank Darryl and your team, Rowan and Carissa. They stayed on top of this. They attended all of the meetings that needed to be where we needed to be, and continually provided updates. We pivoted and moved when we had to, and made calls where we were needed. And it was just really a fantastic time to work with you, Darryl, and your team, and flying out to DC to focus on this. So we're looking forward to the next legislative session, and making another top priority issue, and hopefully having the same success we did with this.
Darryl, the amount of members, the feedback that we've received it's overwhelming. Individually, I mean, almost everybody, I mean, towards the end there, it's obviously hard to get members to follow everything political, and that's what they have us doing. But people are really locked on, and again, it just goes to what Brian said about your guys' advocacy for us. People are, it's a big game changer. To everyone's pocketbook, and it's a big deal.
Thank you, Ben. Likewise, we appreciate having been part of this historic effort. And thank you, Brian, for mentioning my colleagues who were superstars here. But Ben, if I had $1,000 for every time Brian said, "What are we doing on HR 82? Are we doing everything we possibly can? What are we missing? What do we need to get done?" So,
I'm sure you wouldn't need to do this anymore. Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Well, I just felt this was the year, and it really, I'm just super happy with the outcome. So
Appreciate it.
Well, hey, this concludes a shortened episode of On the Job with PORAC. We really just wanted to provide you an update on HR 82 and some of the behind the scenes stuff. But again, I recommend you sign on to the ssa.gov, get an account started. You can see where you're at in that, you making sure you have those necessary credits. But I want to thank Darryl for coming on and sharing his expertise and time with us, and giving us a little bit of inside baseball, which a lot of people don't necessarily get to see or hear about. So remember to like, subscribe, and share this podcast to help us reach more listeners. Till next time, keep fighting the good fight and stay safe out there. This is Brian Marvel with Ben Therriault signing off.